Conventional wisdom may dictate that presidential elections are the most important use of your vote. I'd like to call BS. That's not to say you shouldn't vote in presidential elections. Absolutely do, and do not let anything or anyone, Russian hackers, cyber attacks, for example, stop you from doing so. When you think of why voting for president may be important, some pretty significant reasons come to mind. The president controls our nation's military, important foreign and domestic policy decisions, has significant oversight over the country's budget, etc. But as we learned the hard way in the 2000 election, and hopefully relearned in the 2016 election, the candidate who wins the most actual votes does not always win the presidency, thanks to a little thing called the Electoral College. As a result, individual votes actually matter significantly less in presidential elections than in other local direct elections, especially if you live in a strongly blue state like New York. Again, I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to list reasons for you to sit out the next presidential election. Voting for anything from dog catcher to president is incomparably more important than 5 extra minutes of sleep, your morning coffee, the most recent episode of The Bachelor, or whatever else may come as an opportunity cost. But let's talk about why local elections matter. New York City has frequent elections. In 2016 alone, there were 4 different regularly scheduled elections: the presidential primary in April, the congressional primary in June, the state primary in September, and then the general election in November. This year, there are 2, the municipal primary in September and the general election and statewide referendum in November. There are 5 key reasons local elections matter so much. The first is simple. Your vote literally matters more. Last month, a city council candidate won her Democratic primary election in the district that I live in by 122 votes. The citywide primary that same night saw a turnout of less than 20% of eligible voters, while a special election for state senate in Harlem in April saw less than 8%. The likelihood of your individual vote swaying a local election is exponentially higher than in a national election. Second, local elections elect future presidents. The 3 most recent Democratic presidents, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, and Jimmy Carter, all served in local or state positions prior to being elected to higher office. Pundits often talk about the Democratic bench in context of the 2020 presidential election. Well, it's local elections that most directly contribute to future benches. Promoting and selecting good, decent candidates at the local level is what allows us to build a bench to run smart, experienced candidates for higher office. Third, local office holders are far more accessible to their constituents than their national counterparts. This is in part because they represent fewer constituents, often in geographically smaller districts. But it's also due to the structure of the office. In New York, members of the state legislature are technically employed part-time. Their legislative session spans from January to June, and they're allowed to hold other jobs. The idea behind this was to create a citizen legislature, one that's more in touch and accountable to its constituents than a professional legislature like Congress. Because of the structure of the office, state electeds are able to spend half of the year in the districts they represent. They often take meetings with local constituents, neighborhood groups, and nonprofits, and are more responsive to community concerns. This ties into my 4th point. Local office holders are more directly impactful to their constituents. In New York City, council members can allocate millions of dollars worth of funding towards local capital projects like parks and school improvements, initiatives like art installations or after-school classes, or even directly to local nonprofits. The mayor has executive authority over $30 billion in tax revenue, over 300,000 city employees, and together with the city council, manages a budget of over $80 billion. The final reason to vote in local elections is that there are sometimes important local issues directly on the ballot, often called a ballot measure or referendum. This year, New York City has an important referendum on a constitutional convention, a legally mandated referendum that appears on the New York State ballot every 20 years. If approved by a majority of the voters, the convention would be held in 2019 and would allow elected delegates to amend the Constitution to address important issues: electoral reform, adding same-day voter registration or early voting, campaign finance reform, gerrymandering, even a woman's right to choose would all be fair game. Voters would then have the opportunity to vote to approve or reject the changes to the Constitution. Whatever issues you may care about, better schools, more jobs, funding for cultural institutions, student loan regulations, or just getting a pothole fixed, your local electeds are often more willing and able to help. So do yourself a favor, spend the next 5 to 10 minutes looking up your local elected officials. You can literally Google "who represents me" to find a number of locator resources. Election day is November 7th, polls are open from 6 a.m. until 9 p.m., and you have no excuse not to vote. Thank me later.